Hey everyone, welcome back to another week of MOPA in Focus. I want to thank everyone who's joining us this morning and tuning in from wherever you may be. I hope everybody is staying safe and healthy at this time. I'm going to give a couple minutes for everybody to go ahead and join us this morning for our live stream. And in the meantime, make sure to check out MOPA.org for all the latest information about the museum. That's the wonderful thing about this program is that although we can't all be at the museum right now, unfortunately, we like to keep with the tradition of the Museum of Photographic Arts being a museum without walls. So even though we can't be there in the exhibitions and at the museum, I like to think of this show as being able to bring all the awesome things about the museum to you wherever you may be. And I want to go ahead and also remind you that if you have any questions throughout the live stream this morning about the topic, about things that you're curious about, even things just in general about the museum, go ahead and chat those questions to us, and we'll take a couple breaks in between to make sure that we get to cover those this morning. So, again, MOPA in Focus is really a program that takes a look at artists that are currently on view at the Museum of Photographic Arts and also looks into the collection of the museum to take a look at these really interesting connections. So we like to think that this show is inspired by works on view and then looking at what kind of big ideas are they covering, what kinds of ideas are they looking at, and how does it all come together. And that's the really exciting thing about the museum is that oftentimes we have shows that speak to broader ideas in the collection or artists that are we can almost think of in conversation with each other. And that's a really special thing to be able to explore with you all here this morning. So today's topic is inspired by the works of the artist Yongliang, who's a contemporary Chinese photographer who's part of our current exhibition, Out of the Shadows, Contemporary Chinese Photography. And it's a show with works by 9 different artists that explore all of these different ways that photography can be used in interesting ways and in new ways to explore some big ideas. I want to go ahead and give a shout out to anyone who's tuning in this morning and who have been following this show. Thank you all for sharing about the show and for joining us each week on Fridays at 10 a.m. And so for today, the big idea, as you probably saw, and also located in this description below, is about new technologies. And I think this is a really interesting topic, not just because of the work by the artist that we're going to talk about today, but because of how it speaks to photography itself. Photography has always been, since its very beginning, a medium that looks to innovation in order to push the boundaries of what we can capture using photography and different technologies, but also for what it can give us as the viewer of those images. And I think that'll make a little bit more sense once we get into some of the works that we're going to take a look at today. And so, thinking about the artist that's on view right now, and I'm going to go ahead and actually roll some footage here that we have.
An iconic 13th century Chinese
scroll
sheds some light on the phrase
Yongliang,
and tells of a mythical dragon
really
chasing a pearl in pursuit of knowledge.
But not just for the sake
Inspired
of
by how this ancient narrative plays out by unrolling the scroll, Yongliang recreates the myth for the 21st
and so you can
century.
actually see on
Using virtual
right
reality,
there,
he immerses the viewer more deeply in the story.
Some folks at the museum using the VR to be able to watch his piece, and the piece is called 9 Dragons. And that piece really brings together these two beautiful elements, which is a deep, rich history in Eastern art and in Chinese culture of scrolls, and scrolls being this unfolding narrative that you walk through. If you think about the process of starting at one end of a scroll and slowly unwinding it, and as you do so, this narrative is unfolding as you go through. And so thinking about how new technologies can invite us into that experience in an immersive way, but using 21st century technologies. And of course, I talk about new technologies, but some of these technologies, I guess to call them new is a little bit of a misnomer. And I love showing this image, and I'm going to go ahead and full screen this one. I like to call this image Party Like It's 1899. And so here we have actually a couple people in a drawing room or a parlor in the late 1800s, and they are using stereoscopes and stereoscopic images. And I think a lot of us are probably familiar with stereoscopes in the 20th century sense, the Viewmasters, right? Those red little viewers that had a wheel in them with all of these different images, and we would put the viewer up and we would go ahead and click through the images, and we would see the scene recreated in 3D, right? The illusion of depth. And so when we think about VR, like Yongliang's piece, yes, it's new because it's using fancy new VR headsets, which have a display built into them. But the technology really has been around for quite some time. And I'll give you an example of that. Not only this image here, where they're using viewers to essentially look at images that are like this. And this is what we would call an old stereo card or a stereo view. And we can see it's a card. It's a thick piece of cardboard that has these two images on it, and those two images were taken slightly separated by about the distance that the human eyes are separated. And so when you look at them through a special viewer, I have this one, which is more for a smartphone to be able to put into it. But if you look at those through these old viewer cards, through a viewer that has these two lenses, what happens is it focuses your eyes on those two views in the same way that you would focus on a scene in real life. So instead of seeing a two-dimensional image that's flat, you get this illusion of depth. And stereo views have been around for quite some time, as you can see in this image. But I think the interesting thing about them is what the big deal is about them, right? Why take a two-dimensional image and try to recreate a scene in 3D? And I think for any of us who've probably looked through either an old Viewmaster or perhaps used some of these old stereo cards, you would see it's a really magical experience. And we can use them to look at beautiful landscapes or maybe a far-off destination that we otherwise wouldn't be able to visit. But they can also be this beautiful way to invite us into a narrative. And so to draw this parallel with new technologies, this was something that was very again surprising and exciting and immersive for folks who otherwise at a time would have seen etchings and drawings in textbooks, or they perhaps would have seen photographs starting to be used, but suddenly by bringing in technology like lenses and knowing the science behind the separation of the images, and to be able to kind of bring all of that together, suddenly you pop one of these views into that special viewer, and you are suddenly transported to this other place, this really wonderful experience. And so you might think, well, what's the connection with VR? Well, Again, those old stereo views used a viewer with two lenses, and then this is a viewer that I can actually take my smartphone and I can just pop it inside. And then if we fast all the way forward to today, and maybe some of you have these at home, we have a VR headset, right? A virtual reality headset. And that's really just sort of the next step in the evolution of this technology that's been around, because it has the display built into it, and it's often hardwired to a computer that's running the experience, right? So rather than rely on just these cardboard photos or putting our smartphone in, it has an actual built-in display. And again, it's a really special thing. And I've got this wonderful side-by-side here, which I'd love to share with everyone, just to kind of compare and contrast. Because again, I love to use sort of these examples. And you can see, you know, even though we think of VR technology, these immersive experiences as new technologies, again, the idea, the concept, that broad idea has been around for quite some time in being able to transport people and really immerse them in this experience. And you can see a bit of the similarities there, right? Which is always an interesting thing to take a look at. And there are artists who use this technology in interesting ways. We've had a couple of them on view at the museum. One of the artists, his name is Jim Naughton, and he's sort of a stepping stone, I like to think, between some of the concepts we're talking about today. So we have these old stereo views, and then we have works like Yongliang's VR headset. But the artist Jim Naughton uses stereoscopic images of really interesting scenes in natural history museums, or even staged scenes to create a narrative. And they're new images, but he also creates old school stereo viewers for you to be able to view them through. And again, it's just that idea of being able to invite us into a story or a narrative or an experience beyond just looking at a two-dimensional work in a frame. And I think that's a really exciting thing about not only using new technologies in photography, but also about the shows at the museum. A lot of us have an idea of what we think of photography is, or photographic art, or works in a museum. And while we're certainly fans of classic black and white images or really famous historical images that are important to the history of photography or an idea or a topic or a place, what I love about MOPA is that we're able to, side by side in the same exhibition, have classic works which are a bit more traditional that we would be familiar with. Again, those black and white works or works from the 20th century. And then you can have a seat at this VR station where you're able to experience a work where artists are thinking about these big ideas, how to use technologies in new ways to have this really wild 21st century experience. I want to go ahead and take a moment too, just to remind everyone, wherever you might be tuning in from, to go on and head on over to MOPA.org for more information. You'll find more info about the show that we're talking about today, Out of the Shadows, Contemporary Chinese Photography, but you'll also find general information about the museum, as well as updates and news about what's going on with the museum and when we can all welcome you there again for a visit, and we hope to see everybody there very, very soon. And I want to also go ahead and remind you that if you're watching us on Facebook, to go ahead and make sure you follow us throughout the week. We're always posting really cool content, interesting ideas, activities, and also, if you're watching us on YouTube, make sure to subscribe and to like to our channel. That way you'll go ahead and you'll get a notification when we're going live with some of these really cool programs and interesting topics to talk about each week. So, and I want to also go ahead and remind you, if you have any questions, go ahead and chat those to us, because that's the wonderful thing about this experience, is that I get to answer any of the questions that you might have tuning in this morning. And thank you to Stig Alfelt for tuning in this morning. wherever you might be greeting us from. So now I want to go ahead and head on over and talk a little bit more about the artist that I was mentioning before, who's currently on view at the museum. And that artist is Yongliang. And I'm
An
going to roll a
iconic
little
13th
bit
century
of a
Chinese
clip right
scroll
here
sheds some
before
light
I
on the
actually
phrase
show you the full
and tells
piece.
of a mythical dragon
And
chasing a pearl in
this
pursuit
clip,
of knowledge.
as you can see,
Inspired by how
we
this
have
ancient narrative plays out by
video
unrolling the
work,
scroll,
this
Yang Yongliang
image that's
recreates the
moving,
myth for the 21st
and
century.
then this is how you would
Using
experience
virtual
it
reality,
at the
he
museum,
immerses the viewer more
sitting at the
deeply in the
VR
story.
station with the headset on. And of course, because it's VR, it's 360, right? So you're able to put that headset on and literally look around in an immersive experience. And I love how that builds off of, again, these earlier works, right? Imagine in the 1800s looking at a two-dimensional photograph and thinking, wow, this is so realistic and so much more realistic than, say, a drawing or an etching. But then still knowing that it's a two-dimensional image, right? Even though viewing it, it looks three-dimension, but it's still on board, right? And it's a printed image. But then being able to take a look at an experience in 3D with the assistance of these kinds of new technologies. It's a really fascinating thing. And so I think it's important to talk about a little bit more about the big idea behind the artist and why he created the work that he did. And I'm going to go ahead and roll that on screen for everyone here so that you can get a little bit of a better feel for what the full experience is. And here we have in the background with the title coming up, we have the work by Yang Yongliang, starting off with images that are based on that scroll that I mentioned just earlier. And that scroll was from the Song Dynasty. And it's, again, this narrative scroll called Nine Dragons, which tells a story. And again, that process of unrolling the scroll, we can think of it as, again, moving through this narrative, right? And Yang Yongliang really incorporates that into his work using these visual references. We have, again, those classic images based on the scroll. But then thinking about how do you bring a viewer even closer, even more immersed into that story. And so I think one of the really interesting parts is, too, sometimes folks wonder, well, if it's VR, how is it photographic? And there's a couple ways that you can create a VR experience. You can create it using renderings that you design on the computer, and some of you may be familiar with that from gaming. If any of you enjoy playing some of those role-playing games or multiplayer games, but you can also create a VR 360 experience using images, real images of the world around you. Kind of think about some of those online tools that let you sort of drop into a location and then click and drag and pan around. Those can be created into a VR experience. Or you can do what Yang Yongliang does, which I think is really fascinating and really exciting, is that you can use bits and pieces of photographs. So some of the landscape that we're looking at right here in his work is actually based on photographs, digital photographs that were taken of landscape, of bits and pieces of nature and the city. So we can kind of think about photography in the 21st century and the photographic arts and in the same way that perhaps an artist would explore photo montage in a two-dimensional sense to create something new, we can think of Yongliang using this environment of VR to kind of photo montage bits and pieces of other photographs into this experience that's moving and this narrative, again, that's unfolding for all of us as a viewer, which I think is really interesting. And sometimes people might not necessarily realize that so many of the components in his work are photographic based, right? They're photo based. And so I'm going to go ahead and keep rolling this so you all can see a bit more of the experience. And it's also, I think, important to mention too, well, why 9 dragons and why this scroll? And it's important cultural piece for the artist to be looking at. But also the symbolism that's involved in it. And we've got a great video that's going to be coming up about symbolism in contemporary Chinese photography, and you can check that out on our website as well as on our YouTube channel. So make sure to view that, where we talk a little bit more about the big ideas around symbolism. We all know that we can definitely take a photograph to show something in sort of a 1-to-1 ratio, right? If I take a photo of an apple, then show it to you, you're like, oh wow, hey, that's an apple. But we also know that photography is this beautiful thing that we can speak in metaphor, we can speak in allegory, and we can speak in symbolism, speak visually, right? And so there's a beautiful backstory behind this scroll, which I encourage everyone to go ahead and Google and check it out, the 9 Dragons scroll, about these dragons and why they're pursuing this floating pearl that seems to constantly be eluding them. And they're on this journey that takes them across land, down into the ocean, and then up through the clouds and into the sky. And again, those are all wider cultural references and metaphors for some really beautiful concepts in Chinese history and culture and society. And so I hope all of you get the chance to visit the museum soon and to be able to experience this safely, of course. But until then, I want to encourage everyone to go ahead and, again, check out our website at MOPA.org for more information about the work and also the other artists that are on view as part of Out of the Shadows, Contemporary Chinese Photography. And then also check out the artist's website as well. He's got a lot of really cool information, not only about that work that we just viewed today, but also about his other works, which, again, embrace new technologies in these really interesting ways to really invite us all into this story. And then, of course, I want to encourage everyone to go ahead and follow us throughout the week. We're always posting really cool stuff on our Instagram and on Twitter, and you can join us in a conversation about some of these really cool artists. And then, of course, on Facebook, right? We're always posting really cool content throughout the week. And if any of you with families out there, with kids and with youth, we have this really cool program called Through My Lens, which takes some of these really big concepts and these really big ideas, and I like to think breaks them down into these bite-sized activities that you can do at home with supplies that you have laying around. So no fancy equipment or anything like that. Really just an opportunity to have fun exploring photography through technique, to say something interesting about your current experience or what you're seeing, the world, again, through your lens. So make sure, again, to check out all those different places. Oh, and before we go today, we've got some wonderful comments coming through. A comment from Jenny Reswig. This is so beautiful. Hey, Jenny, thanks again for joining us this morning. This is so beautiful. I hope we get a chance to see this on headset someday. I can only imagine how lovely it is in VR. And it's absolutely true. again, photography has had this long tradition of trying to invite us into the scene, right? The edges sort of melt away when we're really immersed in a photograph. And again, these technologies, from stereoscopes in the 1800s to the Viewmasters in the 1900s, and now VR in the 2000s, the 21st century, again, they're all ways to really invite us into this beautiful immersive experience. And then another comment from Marv. Hey, Marv, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope to see you at the museum soon, and I hope you're staying safe. Spectacular interplay between the background and the foreground. And that's really true. You know, I think so many of us think of photography, again, in a still sense, right? Or some of us might be filmmakers, or even just like to shoot video on our phones, and we think of it in that way. But VR and these kinds of technologies not only let you play with photographic elements, right? Bringing those into this environment, but it lets you really play with them in a way that you can, again, create. You can have full control over how certain things appear, how things recede in the distance, and you get to really think about your viewer, right? So as a photographer, you're thinking about what you want to capture, but you're also thinking about what are people going to be taking away from it when they're looking at it. With things like VR, you get to decide, well, where is my subject standing? And how are the objects and the components around them, how are those related to where the subject is standing in that experience? And so in a lot of these scenes in Nine Dragons, the dragon, you know, you'll look down in the VR headset and you'll notice a dragon swooping right below you. Or in some of those scenes where they're heading down into the water, you'll see different details of the surrounding environment in really beautiful ways. So I want to again thank everybody for joining us today. Make sure you tune in next week, because we're actually going to take a look at something a little related to this, but looking at artists who use the idea of installation. And again, you know, a lot of times we think of photographs as flat, framed, on a wall, but I think as Yongliang shows us today, it doesn't necessarily have to be. And we have artists also who create work that we like to call installation-based, which really means that it's about, again, thinking about us as the viewer, where we're standing, how we're looking at it, what the lighting is like, what the angle is like, and they're printing or making their photographs in interesting ways that really play on that idea. So again, rather than walking up to a photograph, it might be about being able to move around something that is photo-based, or looking at how something changes as the light changes or as your angle changes. So that's what we're going to explore next week. We're going to take a look at an artist, Wang De, that creates these beautiful photo installations using transparencies. And we'll also take a look at another artist in the collection, Susan Rankaitis, that creates photo-based work that really is installation. You can walk all the way around it, and we had it as part of one of our last shows at the museum, and we'll make sure to show some footage of that as well, so you can all see just what we're talking about. So make sure to tune in next week at 10 a.m. on Friday for another MOPA in Focus, and I want to thank all of you again for joining us on this Friday morning. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we look forward to seeing you next week for another MOPA in Focus.